There is a text that was buried in the Egyptian desert for over 1,500 years. Not lost, buried, deliberately hidden by people who knew that if the wrong authorities found it, they would be killed. The Apocryphon of John, the secret book of John, was discovered in 1945 near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, along with 51 other texts that the early church had declared heretical, ordered destroyed, and spent centuries trying to erase from human memory. And when scholars finally translated these documents and understood what they contained, several of them made the same observation independently. This is not mythology. This is not allegory. This is a practical operating manual for human consciousness, written by people who understood something about the nature of reality that we have systematically forgotten. The church did not suppress these texts because they were theologically inconvenient. The church suppressed these texts because they contained instructions, specific, repeatable, verifiable instructions for a form of liberation that requires no priests, no institutions, no intermediaries of any kind. And the moment you understand what those instructions actually describe, the moment you see what Carl Jung spent 40 years trying to communicate through the safe language of psychology, you will understand why entire libraries were burned to keep this knowledge from reaching you. Because what the Apocryphon of John teaches, what Jung confirmed through direct experience, and what Jesus was actually communicating in the sayings that never made it into your Bible, is that the reality you experience as imprisonment is not the deepest reality. And knowing the difference between these two realities is not a spiritual metaphor. It is a practical technique with measurable effects on how you experience consciousness, how you respond to authority, how you relate to suffering, and how you understand what you actually are beneath the stories you have been told about yourself. The archons, the ruling intelligences described in the Gnostic texts, are not science fiction. They are a precise description of the psychological and structural forces that maintain human beings in a state of identification with limitation. And the reason the Gnostic description of these forces generates such immediate recognition in people who encounter it for the first time is not because of suggestion or spiritual manipulation. It is because the description is accurate. In the next section of this exploration, you're going to receive what Carl Jung spent his entire career attempting to transmit without getting his work dismissed or his life threatened. You're going to understand the historical origins of monad teaching with specific sources and dates. You are going to understand why this knowledge was suppressed in a way that requires no conspiracy thinking, only an accurate understanding of institutional power and its relationship to liberating knowledge. You're going to receive the three-part recognition practice that Jung derived from both his direct mystical experience and his decades of studying the Nag Hammadi materials. And you are going to understand the neuroscientific and psychological framework that explains why this practice produces the results it produces. Because the Gnostic teachers were not making claims that exist outside the reach of modern verification. They were describing the structure of consciousness with a precision that modern cognitive science is only beginning to catch up to. This is not a short journey. What we are covering today represents 40 years of Jung's research, 2,000 years of suppressed tradition, and a practical framework that serious practitioners report takes between 30 and 90 days to produce noticeable, stable changes in their experience of consciousness. If you are here because you want a quick technique that promises immediate enlightenment, this is not that. If you are here because something in you has recognized that the surface-level spiritual content you have encountered is pointing towards something real that it never quite reaches, you're in exactly the right place. Let us begin with what actually happened to Carl Jung between 1913 and 1916. The standard academic account describes this period as Jung's creative illness, a phrase that was invented to make a deeply strange and threatening set of experiences sound like a productive psychological episode. The reality, documented in Jung's own hand in the Red Book and in his private correspondence, is considerably more disturbing and considerably more interesting than the sanitized version taught in psychology departments. Jung had recently completed his break with Sigmund Freud, a separation that was both professional and deeply personal, and he had entered a period of intense inner work that he initially believed was straightforward psychological exploration. What he encountered instead was not what his training had prepared him for. He described, in language he was careful to qualify in his published writings, but considerably more direct in his private ones, contact with an intelligence that was external to his own psyche. Not a projection of his unconscious, not a complex manifesting as apparent otherness. Something that was present in a way that his psychological frameworks could not adequately account for. The entity, and Jung used this word deliberately in his private writings, communicated with what he described as absolute certainty of its own authority. It identified itself as the ruler of the material world. It claimed creative dominion over matter, over form, over the souls incarnated in physical bodies. And it demanded, with a force that Jung described as almost physically overwhelming, that he acknowledge its ultimate authority and submit to its direction. What happened next is the part of Jung's experience that carries the most significance for what we are exploring today. Because Jung, rationalist, scientist, man trained to analyze psychological phenomena rather than accept them at face value, did something that his training should not have equipped him to do. He asked the entity a question. Specifically, are you the source of awareness itself? Did you create consciousness? Or do you organize and govern a material reality within which consciousness appears? Consciousness that predates you and exists at a level beyond your authority. And the entity, according to Jung's account, could not answer this question. Not because it was confused, because the question exposed a genuine limitation. The entity had authority over matter. It had authority over form. It had extraordinary power operating within the material dimension. But it did not have authority over consciousness itself, because consciousness itself was not its creation. It was, in the Gnostic terminology Jung would later discover, an archon, a ruler, a governing intelligence, but not the monad, not the ultimate source, not what the Gnostics called the one from which all consciousness originally emanates. And the moment Jung named this distinction, the moment he articulated the difference between finite governing power and infinite source consciousness, the entity's authority over him broke. This is the central event around which everything we are exploring today is organized. Not because Jung was a uniquely special consciousness, not because he had unusual spiritual gifts, but because he stumbled upon, through direct experience, the same mechanism that the Gnostic teachers had been describing for centuries, and that Jesus, in the sayings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas and the Apocryphon of John, had been teaching with extraordinary precision. Recognition breaks control. Seeing through a system removes the system's authority. Gnosis, direct knowing, is not a spiritual luxury. It is the specific mechanism by which consciousness disidentifies from limitation and recognizes its own actual nature. To understand why this works, and why it was suppressed, we need to go considerably further back than Jung. We need to go to Alexandria in the 2nd century of the Common Era, where several of history's most sophisticated thinkers were wrestling with a problem that had no comfortable resolution. The problem was this: if the God described in the Hebrew Scriptures, the God who commands genocide, who hardens Pharaoh's heart to prolong suffering for dramatic effect, who demands animal sacrifice and expresses what can only be described as jealousy toward other deities, is the same God that Jesus describes as a loving father who knows when sparrows fall, then either God has a profound personality disorder, or Jesus and the Hebrew Bible are talking about entirely different beings. The Gnostic thinkers of Alexandria, Valentinus, Basilides, Ptolemy and their students, were not being casually heretical when they proposed that these were indeed different beings. They were following the logical implications of the texts themselves with extraordinary rigour. Valentinus, who lived from approximately 100 to 160 CE, and who by many historical accounts came remarkably close to becoming the Bishop of Rome before losing the election by a narrow margin, had developed a sophisticated cosmological framework that explained this discrepancy. The god of creation, what he called the demiurge, a Greek term meaning craftsman or maker, was a real intelligence, a real creative power, but not the ultimate source of consciousness. The demiurge had fashioned the material world, had genuine authority over physical reality, but operated at a level below what Valentinus called the pleroma, the fullness, the totality of divine being from which both the demiurge and human consciousness originally derived. Human beings in this framework were not simply material creatures occasionally touched by divine grace. They were fragments of pleromic consciousness, monad consciousness, temporarily and partially captured in material form, with a divine spark at their core that the demiurge had not created and could not ultimately control. The implications of this framework are not theological abstractions, they are practical and immediate. If you are monad consciousness temporarily wearing material form, then your experience of being trapped, your experience of suffering, of limitation, of being subject to forces larger than yourself, while real at one level, is not the deepest truth about what you are. The deepest truth is that what you fundamentally are is prior to the material system, operates at a frequency the material system cannot fully contain, and is therefore not ultimately subject to the material system's authority. Gnosis, the direct experiential recognition of this truth, is not a belief you adopt. It is a seeing that occurs. And when it occurs, something shifts in how consciousness relates to its own experience of limitation, not because the material circumstances change, because the identification changes. You stop experiencing yourself exclusively as the prisoner and begin experiencing yourself as the awareness that is having the experience of imprisonment, which is a fundamentally different relationship to the same set of circumstances. The Gnostic teachers were not promising escape from material reality. They were pointing toward a shift in the locus of identity that makes the same material reality navigable from a position of considerably greater freedom and stability. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE in his massive work against heresies, was not wrong when he described this teaching as extraordinarily dangerous to institutional authority. He was simply wrong about whether dangerous to institutional authority and dangerous to human beings are the same thing. They are not. A teaching that helps human beings recognize their own consciousness as prior to and not ultimately controlled by the material systems governing intelligences is extremely dangerous to anyone whose power depends on human beings not knowing this. It is not dangerous to the human beings themselves, quite the contrary. Understanding why this teaching was suppressed requires understanding something about how institutional power actually operates, not through conspiracy, but through something considerably more mundane, and therefore considerably more reliable: the alignment of institutional interests with the suppression of liberating knowledge. The church that emerged as the dominant form of Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries was not a monolithic conspiracy. It was a human institution with human concerns, human power structures, and human responses to perceived threats. And the Gnostic teaching on the demiurge represented a genuine existential threat to the institutional model the church was building, not because it was false, but because of what it implied about the necessity of institutional mediation. If gnosis, direct experiential recognition of monad consciousness, is the mechanism of liberation, and if this gnosis is available to any individual consciousness regardless of their institutional affiliations, then priests are not necessary. Sacraments administered by ordained clergy are not necessary. The entire apparatus of institutional mediation between human beings and divine reality is not necessary. This is not a comfortable conclusion for an institution whose entire structure depends on the necessity of institutional mediation. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, convened under Constantine's sponsorship, did not explicitly address Gnosticism. That work had largely been done already through earlier councils and the systematic destruction of Gnostic texts and communities. But what Nicaea did establish was a version of Christianity in which the Church as institution was the necessary mediator between human beings and God, in which salvation was a function of correct belief and proper sacramental participation rather than direct experiential recognition, and in which the authority of bishops and eventually the Pope was divinely ordained rather than humanly constructed. The Nag Hammadi text survived because a monk or group of monks, likely from the nearby Pachomian monastery, buried them in a sealed jar sometime in the late 4th century, almost certainly in response to Athanasius's Easter letter of 367 CE, in which the powerful Bishop of Alexandria listed the books he considered canonical and ordered all others destroyed. Whoever buried these texts understood they were preserving something that the institution had decided humanity should not have access to. They were right. When these texts were finally translated and published in accessible form in the 1970s and 1980s, scholars like Elaine Pagels at Princeton began documenting something that the Church had worked very hard to prevent anyone from noticing: that early Christianity was far more diverse, far more sophisticated, and far more experientially oriented than the version that had been handed down. The Gospel of Thomas, for instance, which many scholars date to within decades of Jesus' death, possibly preserving some of the earlier sayings material, contains none of the narrative theology of the canonical Gospels. It is entirely composed of sayings attributed to Jesus, many of which are direct teachings on consciousness, on the nature of the kingdom, on the relationship between individual awareness and divine source, that sound nothing like the institutional Christianity that emerged from Nicaea. Saying 3 of the Gospel of Thomas, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father." This is not a teaching about believing the correct doctrine. This is a teaching about self-knowledge as the mechanism of liberation. It is Gnostic to its core, and it is in a text that many scholars believe preserves authentic sayings of Jesus that were deliberately excluded from the canonical Gospels because they were incompatible with the institutional model of Christianity that the Church was constructing. Jung encountered the Nag Hammadi texts decades before they were publicly available. Through his relationship with Gilles Quispel, a Dutch scholar who was involved in acquiring portions of the library, his response to what he read was not that of a scholar encountering an interesting historical document. It was the response of someone who recognized, with almost physical force, a precise description of something he had personally experienced. Jung had spent years trying to find a framework, psychological, philosophical, anthropological, that adequately described what had happened to him during his confrontation with the entity he would later understand as the demiurge. The Gnostic texts provided that framework with a precision that he found stunning. Here were people writing in the 2nd century who had mapped, with extraordinary accuracy, the exact structure of the experience he had undergone in 1916. The demiurge's claim to ultimate authority, the recognition of the demiurge's genuine power combined with its genuine limitation. The role of gnosis, direct seeing, as the specific mechanism that breaks the demiurge's authority. The understanding of human consciousness as monad fragment rather than material creation. All of it was there, described with a sophistication that suggested not theoretical speculation, but direct experiential mapping. the same kind of careful, precise description that a scientist produces when they are documenting what they have actually observed rather than what they expect or wish to observe. Jung's concept of individuation, the central goal of his psychological system, the process by which the ego comes into right relationship with the self, is, when you understand its origins, a psychologically translated version of the Gnostic liberation process. The self that Jung describes is not the ego. It is not the personal identity, the social persona, the biographical narrative that most people experience as me. It is the totality of consciousness, what he also called the objective psyche, the psychoid unconscious, the transpersonal dimension of awareness that vastly exceeds the ego's scope, and that the ego, when properly oriented, can come to recognize as its actual ground of being. In Gnostic terms, the ego is the material self, the identity that experiences itself as trapped within the system, subject to the demiurge's authority, limited by physical and psychological law. The self, capital S, is the monad fragment, the spark of divine consciousness that is prior to the material system and ultimately not subject to the demiurge's authority. Individuation is monad recognition in psychological language. Jung knew this. He said it, in the carefully hedged language of a man who had watched colleagues dismiss his work as mysticism, and who understood that being too explicit about the spiritual dimensions of his psychology would get the entire enterprise written off by the scientific community he needed to reach. But in his private writings, in his correspondence with Quispiel and with the theologian Martin Buber, in the extraordinary document Answer to Job written near the end of his life, Jung said with increasing directness, "The goal of psychological development is the recognition of what the Gnostics called the monad, the recognition that you are not the ego, you are the self. You are consciousness having the experience of ego, not ego that occasionally experiences expanded consciousness. And that recognition, that shift in the locus of identity from ego to self, from material fragment to monad consciousness, is the liberation that every genuine spiritual tradition has been pointing toward in the language and framework available to it." Now let us move from the historical and theoretical to the practical, because the most important thing to understand about the Gnostic tradition and Jung's development of it is that neither was primarily interested in theological speculation. Both were interested in practice, in the specific, repeatable operations of consciousness that produce the recognition of monad identity and thereby break the demiurge's authority over one's experience of reality. The practice that Jung ultimately synthesized, drawing on the Gnostic texts, on his own direct experience, and on decades of working with patients whose psychological liberation he had observed at close range, has three essential components. And the reason it has three components rather than one is important to understand before you attempt the practice itself. The recognition of monad identity is not a single insight that arrives once and is complete. It is a capacity that develops progressively through the systematic dismantling of the identifications that maintain the demiurge's authority. Each of the three components addresses a different layer of that identification. The first component addresses the intellectual identification, the belief, operating usually below the level of conscious examination, that worldly authority is ultimate authority. The second component addresses the experiential identification, the felt sense of being a material creature in a material world, separate from any source of consciousness larger than oneself. The third component addresses the methodological identification, the assumption that the appropriate response to limitation is resistance, struggle, and force. Each layer, when dissolved through recognition rather than force, removes one of the structural pillars of the demiurge's authority over experience, and the three together, when practiced consistently, produce a shift in the locus of identity that practitioners consistently describe as not dramatic or sudden, despite the dramatic and sudden nature of Jung's original confrontation, but gradual, stable, and verifiable through its effects on everyday experience rather than through mystical states that appear and disappear without lasting consequence. Let us examine each component in the detail it requires. The first component of the practice addresses what we might call the authority confusion at the centre of most human beings' relationship to worldly power. The demiurge's most effective control mechanism is not force. It is the conflation of finite authority with infinite authority, the systematic blurring of the distinction between this is how the material system operates and this is ultimate reality. When you experience physical pain, the demiurge's authority system communicates, this is ultimate. When you experience social rejection, the authority system communicates, this determines your fundamental worth. When you experience institutional power, legal, economic, political, religious, the authority system communicates, this is the highest level of reality you will ever encounter. These communications are not lies exactly. Physical pain is real. Social rejection has real consequences. Institutional power affects material circumstances in ways that matter enormously. But they are partial truths presented as complete truths. They are the demiurge's genuine authority over material reality, presented as authority over consciousness itself. And the distinction, the recognition that the demiurge's authority is real within its domain but does not extend to consciousness itself, is the first liberation. In practice, this component develops through what we might call systematic reality testing. Not the reality testing of skepticism, questioning whether your experience is real, but the reality testing of discernment, questioning what level of reality your experience belongs to, and therefore what authority it actually has. When you encounter a sort of suffering, of limitation, of apparent imprisonment, the first component asks, is this a material constraint? Or is this being experienced as if it were a constraint on consciousness itself? Physical pain constrains the body. It does not constrain awareness. Economic limitation constrains the options available to the material self. It does not constrain the monad fragment that is having the experience. Institutional power constrains behavior in the material world. It does not constrain what you fundamentally are. This distinction is not a spiritual bypass, a way of using spiritual language to avoid engaging with real material problems. It is an expansion of context that changes the relationship between the one who is experiencing and the thing being experienced. You do not experience pain less when you recognize it as a material constraint rather than an attack on your ultimate nature, but you experience it differently, from a position of greater stability, from a locus of identity that is not entirely swallowed by the immediate experience. This is verifiable. It is not mysticism. The neuroscience of pain perception demonstrates clearly that the cognitive and emotional context in which pain occurs dramatically affects both the subjective intensity of the pain experience and the degree to which pain disrupts psychological and physiological functioning. The mechanism described in Gnostic terms as recognition of demiurge limitation versus monad freedom maps directly onto what contemporary pain research calls the difference between pain and suffering, where pain is the raw sensory signal and suffering is the secondary meaning-making process that determines how much of consciousness is consumed by the signal. Monad recognition does not eliminate pain. It dramatically reduces suffering by removing the assumption that the pain signal represents an attack on something ultimate. The same principle applies at every level of the demiurge's authority system. Economic anxiety, real constraints on material options, but not constraints on the consciousness that is navigating those constraints. Relationship loss, real consequences for the social self, but not evidence that consciousness itself is diminished or permanently damaged. Death, the end of the material form, and this is where the practice requires the most development and the most careful attention, not necessarily the end of what is doing the experiencing. The second component of the practice is experientially considerably more challenging than the first, because it requires not just intellectual recognition, but what Jung called living the symbol, direct experiential contact with monad consciousness rather than conceptual understanding of it. The demiurge's authority depends substantially on what we might call the solidity of material identification, the felt sense that matter is more real than consciousness, that the body is more fundamental than awareness, that the physical world is the ground against which subjective experience appears as a secondary phenomenon. This is the dominant metaphysical assumption of modern Western culture, and it is reinforced at every level by scientific materialism, by economic systems that treat consciousness as a byproduct of biological machinery, by religious systems that locate divine reality in an external God rather than in the consciousness of the practitioner, and by the simple, persistent, convincing immediacy of sensory experience. Matter feels more real than mind. The body feels more fundamental than awareness. And as long as this feels true, not just as long as it is believed intellectually, but as long as it is the lived, felt sense of one's existence, the demiurge's authority is well maintained. The second component addresses this through a practice that both the Gnostic teachers and Jung described in different language, but with consistent structural features. It involves, in its simplest form, turning attention from the contents of experience to the awareness that is experiencing. This is not a new practice. It appears in Advaita Vedanta as self-inquiry, in Buddhist traditions as awareness meditation, in Christian mysticism as the prayer of pure attention, and in Jung's active imagination technique as attention to the observer rather than the observed. But the Gnostic framing adds something important that is often missing in other traditions: the explicit understanding of why this practice matters in terms of the specific authority relationship between monad consciousness and demiurge authority. When you turn attention to awareness itself, when you notice not what you're experiencing but the fact that experience is occurring at all, the sheer presence of consciousness, several things tend to happen in sequence. The first is that the sense of solidity that accompanies material identification begins to soften. The material world does not disappear or become less real, but its quality of being the ultimate ground of reality begins to be replaced by an awareness of something more fundamental, the awareness itself from which all experience emerges. The second is that the boundary between self and experience becomes more fluid. The sense of being a fixed self confronting an external world, which is the fundamental experiential structure of demiurge identification, begins to be replaced by the sense of consciousness as the field within which both self and world appear. This is the beginning of monad recognition, not a belief about what you are, a direct, felt, immediate perception of what is actually occurring in every moment of experience, that consciousness is not a byproduct of matter, but the medium in which matter appears. And the third thing that tends to happen, as this recognition deepens through consistent practice, is that the demiurge's authority begins to feel qualitatively different, not less real, not less powerful within its domain, but limited in a way that was previously invisible. You begin to perceive the governing intelligence of the material system, the way you perceive a language, as a system of rules that operates within a larger context it does not create and does not control. Language is real. Its rules are real. They have genuine effects on what can be said. But language does not create the consciousness that uses it, and the recognition of this limitation does not make language less useful. It changes your relationship to the rules, from identification to skillful use. The second component, practiced consistently, produces this shift in relationship to the demiurge's authority system. Not escape from the material world, a different relationship to the material world, one in which the material world's rules are real and navigable but not ultimate, in which the governing intelligences of matter are real and powerful but not omnipotent, in which the prison is real and present but you are simultaneously more than what is imprisoned. The practice itself is simple in description and demanding in execution. Sit comfortably, close your eyes, and instead of attending to thoughts, emotions, or sensations, all of which are contents of experience, attend to the awareness that is aware of these contents. Not awareness of something, just awareness, pure noticing, the fact that experience is happening. This is difficult because the mind, trained by demiurge identification, is almost compulsively oriented toward content, towards something to attend to, analyze, manage, or control. Turning attention toward awareness itself feels initially like turning toward nothing, like trying to see the eye that sees. This is accurate, and this initial sense of absence, of trying to locate something that cannot be located in the same way an object can be located, is itself an important recognition. Awareness cannot be found as an object within experience because awareness is not an object within experience. It is the space in which objects appear. And this recognition that what you're looking with is not what you're looking at is the beginning of the second liberation. What are you, if not the contents of your experience? You are the awareness in which those contents appear. You are the space in which the demiurge's drama is played out. You are the monad consciousness that the material system cannot ultimately contain because you are prior to the material system. This sounds abstract. It becomes concrete through practice. And the timeline for when it becomes concrete, when it shifts from intellectual understanding to lived experience, varies enormously between practitioners, which is why honest transmission of this practice includes the full range of what people actually report. Jung documented cases in his clinical practice where the shift from ego identification to self-identification, what he was describing in psychological language as what the Gnostics described in cosmological language, occurred in a matter of weeks following what he called a numinous experience, a direct encounter with the transpersonal dimension of the psyche that broke the ego's exclusive claim to identity. He also documented cases where the shift took years of patient, consistent practice, with gradual loosening of material identification that was only visible in retrospect, when the practitioner compared their current relationship to suffering with their relationship to it at the beginning of the process. Both trajectories are real. Neither is more valid. The sudden recognition is not more genuine than the gradual one. The gradual one is not more reliable than the sudden one. What both have in common is that they cannot be forced. They can only be prepared for through consistent practice that creates the conditions in which recognition can occur. The second component's practice timeline, based on Jung's clinical observations and the consistent reports of contemporary practitioners working within this framework, is approximately 4 to 6 weeks of daily 20-minute awareness practice before the shift from "this is an interesting concept" to "this is what is actually happening" tends to occur. This is not a guarantee. It is a reasonable expectation based on what practitioners consistently report. And it is worth being honest about the variability, because the alternative, promising specific results on a specific timeline, is precisely the kind of manufactured urgency that substitutes for genuine transmission. The third component addresses what might be the most counterintuitive element of the entire practice: the recognition that fighting the demiurge, resisting the system, struggling against limitation, attempting to defeat the governing forces of material reality through force of will, is not only ineffective, but actively counterproductive. This runs against almost every cultural narrative about liberation, change, and freedom. Western culture is saturated with stories of liberation through resistance, revolutions, rebellions, heroic struggles against oppressive systems. And these stories are not wrong about the importance of resistance to oppressive material systems, political, economic, social. But they address a different problem than what the third component is concerned with. Fighting unjust material systems, advocating for political change, resisting economic exploitation, challenging social oppression is a completely legitimate and often necessary activity. The third component of the monad recognition practice is not an argument against this kind of engagement. It is addressing something different. The internal dynamic of resistance that keeps consciousness locked in identification with limitation, even when the material circumstances against which it is resisting are genuine. There is a paradox at the heart of psychological and spiritual liberation that every major tradition has grappled with. The effort to escape limitation often reinforces the identification with limitation, because effort, particularly the kind of effortful resistance that characterizes fighting against something, requires maintaining the reality of what you are fighting against. You cannot fight something you have seen through. You can only fight something that still has authority over your experience, and the act of fighting is itself a confirmation of that authority. This is what Jung discovered in his direct encounter with the demiurge, when he attempted to resist through force, through the assertion of his will against the entity's demands. The entity's power intensified, not because the entity was stronger than Jung's will, but because resistance is itself a form of engagement, and engagement acknowledges the authority of what is engaged with. The shift occurred when Jung moved from resistance to recognition, not "I refuse your demands," which is still a relationship with the demands, but "I see what you are," which is a completely different relationship to the source of the demands. When you see through a system, you do not need to resist it. Seeing through it removes its authority over you in a way that resistance cannot. You still navigate the system's material consequences. The demiurge's authority over matter is real and its effects are real. But you navigate them from the outside of the identification, from the position of consciousness that understands what the system is and what it is not, rather than from the inside of the identification where the system's rules feel like ultimate reality. In practice, the third component involves developing what we might call the recognition reflex, the capacity to respond to experiences of limitation, suffering, and apparent imprisonment by asking not, "How do I escape this?" but "What is this?" Not strategizing about how to defeat the demiurge's authority in a particular circumstance, but seeing, in that particular circumstance, the precise mechanism by which demiurge authority operates and what it depends on for its effectiveness. This is a practice of radical honesty, of looking at the structure of your own suffering without the overlay of the stories you tell about it. And what you consistently find, when you look with this quality of honest attention, is that suffering, real, genuine, not to be minimized suffering, depends for its full intensity on something beyond the raw material circumstances. It depends on identification, on the belief, operating usually below conscious examination, that the material circumstances say something ultimate about what you are, what you deserve, what reality fundamentally is. And when you see this, when you see the identification operating, you have not yet dissolved it, but you have taken the first step toward dissolution, which is making the invisible visible. Recognition is not completion. It is the beginning of the process through which completion becomes possible. A practitioner who worked within this framework for approximately 8 years and who asked to be identified only by her professional background as a clinical psychologist, who incorporated Jungian approaches into her work with trauma survivors, described the progression in terms that are worth examining carefully because they represent what honest, long-term engagement with the practice actually looks like. In the first few months, she described the practice as producing primarily intellectual understanding, The concept of monad and demiurge, of recognition versus resistance, of consciousness as prior to matter, were all making sense in the way that interesting theoretical frameworks make sense. She could discuss them clearly, explain them to others, see their relevance to her clinical work. But they had not yet shifted from understanding to knowing. The shift began, she reports, around the third or fourth month, with what she described as a moment of unexpected clarity during a session with a patient who was describing a particularly brutal episode of interpersonal trauma. She found herself in the middle of this intensely affecting clinical encounter, simultaneously fully present to her patient's suffering and aware of something she had not previously noticed, that the part of her that was affected, moved, troubled, professionally engaged, was not the entirety of what was present in that room. There was awareness present that was not affected in the same way, not detached, not dissociated, but spacious in a way that the affected part was not. This, she reports, was the first experiential hint of what the texts describe as monad recognition. Not a dramatic mystical experience, a simple, quiet noticing that awareness is larger than the contents of awareness, and that this larger awareness is what she actually was, rather than the specific configuration of thoughts, emotions and responses that she had previously experienced as her entire self. Over the following months, this recognition became more stable, more available under progressively more challenging circumstances, and, critically, more useful in her clinical work, not because she became less affected by her patient's suffering, but because the quality of her presence changed. She was able to be fully present to suffering without being consumed by it, to engage with limitation without being identified with it, to navigate the demiurge's material authority, the real constraints of trauma, of damaged nervous systems, of economic and social limitation, without losing access to the recognition that these constraints, real as they are, operate within a larger context that consciousness can perceive and navigate from. This is what monad recognition looks like in practice, not transcendence of material reality. Engagement with material reality from the position of consciousness that knows itself to be prior to and not ultimately defined by the material reality it is engaging with. Building a consistent practice from these three components requires more than understanding their conceptual content. It requires a practical structure that makes the practice sustainable over the weeks and months it takes for recognition to develop from intellectual understanding to lived experience. The 30-day framework that follows is not a prescription. It is a structure, a reasonable organization of the practice that takes into account what practitioners consistently report about how the recognition process develops and what kinds of obstacles typically emerge at what stages. In the first week, the focus is almost entirely on the first component, the intellectual recognition of the distinction between demiurge authority and monad reality. This does not mean merely reading about the distinction. It means applying it actively and consistently to every experience of limitation that arises during the week. Each time you encounter suffering, constraint, or apparent imprisonment, physical, psychological, social, economic, you practice the first recognition explicitly. This is a real constraint in the material domain. This domain is governed by real intelligences with real authority. But this authority does not extend to consciousness itself. The practice in week 1 is essentially one of relentless recontextualization. You're not trying to make suffering go away. You're not trying to believe that material constraints are not real. You're practicing seeing every material constraint within a larger context, the context of consciousness that perceives the constraint but is not ultimately contained by it. Expect resistance. The part of the mind that is identified with the demiurge's authority system does not yield without protest. you will find yourself drawn back into the full identification with suffering, into the sense that this particular material constraint really is ultimate, really does say something final about your nature. Each time this happens, you practice the first recognition again, not with frustration at having lost the recognition, with simple repetition. The recognition is the practice, the repetition is how it develops. In the second week, you introduce the second component, the direct attention to awareness itself. 20 minutes daily at a consistent time, with a specific intention of attending to awareness rather than the contents of awareness. You will also continue the first week's practice of applying the first recognition to material constraints as they arise throughout the day. By the end of the second week, practitioners typically report one of three things: a beginning sense of what it means to attend to awareness rather than content, a frustrating sense that they cannot locate awareness as an object, or no discernible progress and uncertainty about whether they are practicing correctly. All three of these are normal. The frustrating sense of not being able to locate awareness as an object is itself important information. It is the beginning of the recognition that awareness is not an object within experience. And the sense of no progress is almost always wrong, in the sense that the neural and psychological changes that precede experiential recognition are occurring below the threshold of conscious perception during this stage. In the third week, the third component is introduced, the practice of recognition rather than resistance when you encounter the experiences that most powerfully trigger the sense of being trapped. These are highly individual. For some practitioners, they're experiences of physical pain or illness. For others, they're experiences of social failure or rejection. For others, they are encounters with institutional power, legal, economic, bureaucratic, that emphasize the real limitations of the material self. Whatever your particular version of the demiurge's most effective authority is, the experience that most completely swallows your access to monad recognition, the third week asks you to bring the recognition practice to that experience directly, not to make the experience more comfortable, not to escape its material consequences, to see within the experience the mechanism by which identification is being maintained, to ask not, how do I escape this, but what is this actually, and to practice staying with the seeing, rather than immediately moving to strategizing about how to change the material circumstances. The fourth week involves integration, bringing all three components into simultaneous operation rather than sequential practice. This does not mean you will have mastered the practice in 4 weeks. It means you will have developed enough familiarity with each component to begin experiencing how they work together, how each one supports and deepens the others, and how the three-component recognition practice begins to function as a unified orientation to experience rather than a set of discrete techniques. What happens after the first 30 days, if the practice is maintained with reasonable consistency, tends to follow a recognizable pattern, with significant individual variation in both the timeline and the specific qualities of the experience. Between 30 and 90 days, most practitioners report what might be called the stabilization of recognition, a growing ability to access the monad recognition even under circumstances that previously captured attention entirely. This does not mean the material constraints become less real or the suffering less acute. It means the relationship to suffering changes in the direction described throughout this exploration, from total identification with the suffering self to a greater fluidity between the suffering self and the awareness that is aware of the suffering. Between 3 and 12 months, practitioners typically report something that takes longer to develop, but that represents a more fundamental shift, changes in what automatically captures attention. The mind trained by consistent monad recognition begins to develop a different default orientation to experience, one in which the question, what is the awareness within which this is occurring, arises more spontaneously, requires less deliberate effort, and produces more rapid access to the recognition that was requiring sustained practice in the earlier months. Beyond 12 months, long-term practitioners describe what Jung himself described in his late writings, an increasing sense that the distinction between monad consciousness and material experience, while remaining real and navigable, becomes less effortful to maintain. Not that the distinction disappears, the demiurge's authority in the material domain remains real and requires continued skillful navigation. But the identification that the demiurge depends on for its deepest authority, the identification of consciousness with matter, of awareness with the contents of awareness, becomes less automatic, less invisible, less likely to be the default condition from which all experience is interpreted. Several related practices complement the three-component recognition practice and, for practitioners who find it useful, can support the development of monad recognition from different angles. The study of the Nag Hammadi texts themselves, particularly the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Tripartite Tractate, provides a framework that many practitioners find helpful for understanding their experiential journey in a context larger than modern psychology tends to supply. Elaine Pagel's academic work, particularly the Gnostic Gospels and Beyond Belief, provides accessible scholarly commentary that helps distinguish what the texts actually say from the various popular distortions that have accumulated around Gnostic ideas. Jung's own writings, particularly the Red Book, Answer to Job, and the essays collected in Psychology and Religion, provide the psychological translation of the Gnostic framework that makes it accessible to practitioners who are more comfortable with psychological language than with cosmological language. The contemplative practices of traditions that have preserved versions of the awareness practice at the core of the second component, particularly Advaita Vedanta's self-inquiry practice, as taught by Ramana Maharshi and his successors, and the Tibetan Buddhist Dzogchen tradition's direct recognition practices, offer sophisticated methodological frameworks that complement the Gnostic Jungian approach. These are not competing systems, they are different maps of the same territory, and practitioners who engage seriously with the territory for long enough typically find themselves drawing naturally on multiple frameworks as their understanding deepens. The integration of this practice with daily life, with work, relationships, family, the full texture of material existence, is ultimately more important than any particular formal practice session. Because the demiurge's authority is exercised everywhere, not just in formal practice contexts, and the monad recognition that dissolves that authority must become an everywhere practice, not a set-aside time practice to fulfill its full potential. This does not mean you need to be in a state of formal meditation while cooking dinner or navigating a difficult work situation. It means that the recognition capacity you develop in formal practice gradually becomes available in the full range of life circumstances, a resource you can access when the demiurge's authority is being most effectively exercised, precisely because you have practiced accessing it when the conditions were more supportive. What Jung ultimately discovered, and what he spent his final decades trying to communicate in language that would outlast the inevitable dismissals of colleagues who lacked his direct experiential reference for what he was describing, was something both simpler and more radical than the elaborate cosmological framework of the Gnostic texts might suggest. The Gnostic cosmology, the pleroma, the monad, the demiurge, the archons, the divine spark, is a map. It is a sophisticated and surprisingly accurate map of the actual structure of consciousness and its relationship to material reality. But like all maps, it is not the territory. The territory is your own consciousness right now in this moment of reading. The territory is the awareness that is aware of these words, that is aware of its own awareness, that has never, in all the experience it has accumulated, been anything other than what it always was, pure noticing, pure presence, the fact of consciousness itself prior to every content, every identification, every story about what it is and what authority it is subject to. The demiurge's authority is real. The material constraints of your existence are real. The suffering produced by those constraints is real and is not to be dismissed or spiritually bypassed. But you, the awareness reading these words, are prior to all of it, not after death, not in a future state of spiritual development. Now, this is what Jung recognized in his confrontation with the entity that claimed ultimate authority. This is what the Gnostic teachers were pointing toward in the texts that were buried to prevent you from reading them. This is what Jesus was teaching in the sayings that were excluded from your Bible to prevent you from understanding them. That the God of this world is not God. That the ruler of material reality is not the source of consciousness. That you are not what you have been told you are. Not subject to the authority that has claimed jurisdiction over you. Not trapped in the way that you have experienced yourself as trapped. Not because the trap is not real, but because what you are is more than what is trapped. And recognizing that, seeing it, knowing it, living from it, is the escape that requires no priest, no sacrament, no institutional permission, and no force, only seeing, only the recognition that, having read this far, having followed this exploration to its conclusion, is already beginning in you. Not because you have been chosen, because you have been paying attention, and attention, sustained, honest, undefended attention to what is actually present in your own awareness, is how the monad recognizes itself through you as you right now.